Hello and welcome to this 2021 end of year guest showcase. We've made it through another year. We had some really fantastic guests here on Audiovisual Cultures throughout the past year. Whether you've recently joined us or you're just here for the good parts, this recap of highlights is for you. I'm Paula Blair, and in making Audiovisual Cultures, I investigate a wide range of areas in audiovisual media and the creative industries. These include cinema, television, streaming, live performance, music, audio production, the visual arts and much more. Anything you can think of that might be considered audio and or visual culture, that's what we're into. So this show has been going since March 2018 and we've covered a lot of topics since then. In the past year, I've rebranded the podcast, opened its own dedicated YouTube channel, and have been learning more and more ways of making improvements in sound quality, editing, my performance as an interviewer and communicator, and how to get the show out there in better ways. Our incredible patrons at patreon.com/avcultures have been instrumental in supporting all that work, and I couldn't keep going without them. There are loads of exclusives, extras and early releases on Patreon, so please do find us there and consider giving regular support to sustain and improve the show further. Our hosts Acast have also been tremendous in offering training and tools to facilitate marketing and reach, so big thanks to them as well. If you follow AV Cultures Pod on the socials, you may have seen this year's Spotify Wrapped, through which we learned we've been downloaded in 22 countries in the past year, which I'm really bowled over by. I'm just so grateful anyone's listening at all, but the idea that strangers in countries I've never been to are listening, that's so exciting and I'm really grateful. Massive thanks to everyone wherever and however you're listening. We've got more great things coming your way in 2022, so I really hope you stick with us. For the rest of this episode, we're going to go through some highlights of 2021. We hit the ground running in January with two fascinating discussions with filmmaker Justin McAleece and urban planner Mustafa Sherif, with both in different ways talking about storytelling.
Hopefully when you get on set, a lot of your decisions are already made because you've made them with the producer, the director, the writer, whoever it happens to be, and you already know what you're trying to accomplish. And I mean, really, that's what it comes down to. It's not like, oh, what do I want to do in this situation? That's like a very fourth tier sort of concept. You want to be like, what serves the story? What will help the director accomplish the most amount of information in the least amount of time? And really, that's what you're trying to do. David Fincher, American director, has a quote, like basically, my job as a director is deciding what information to give out when. And that's really what directing is about. And by proxy, that's what cinematography is about, is putting people with a sense of what the context is, what the vital information about a frame is, and where to lead their eye, and how to feel about it subconsciously without even attempting to tell them why they feel about a certain way with the actors or the dialogue or the action or any of that stuff. Just like, 1 second in, you're like, oh, I get what this is.
When I was young, and now maybe I'm too old, but anyway, so I'm listening to TED Talk on YouTube. I was very inspired by them. And what makes a TED Talk special is the way they tell the story. It's not like a lecture in university or a TV program. That's why it's so special. And I was like, okay, but how about mixing this kind of stories in podcasting and urban planning? And also, like after work, I'm part of TEDx Stockholm team. And what we do is like I do content researching, but also like co-coaching people how they talk and giving feedback about their speech. I was trying to combine that, not make a boring lecture and not like so stand-up comedy or something. I want something like as how I would love to listen to. We all know that why we like TV shows and series. It's just storytelling, like it's art and culture. It's about storytelling. So I wanted to do the podcast something like this format. It's not going to be like you're in a police station, like a question and answer, like, okay, what's your name? What do you do? What's your project? Because there are many podcasts like this. And when you listen to them, you feel sometimes bad for the guest. You be like, but give him some time to breathe, to express himself or something like this. So I decided, and I tried my best to that, leave the platform open to the guest, because it's not like Mustafa Sherif podcast. It's Urbanistica. And the idea of Urbanistica is that people are the storytellers, because I'm listening to them and learning. I can start my own show and talk, but the aim of Urbanistica is listening and learning, because this is the goal. Every guest is the storyteller. I just leave them to talk, just like how you do now, like just, leave the flow. And it's always a good flow when you give people the freedom to express themselves. And always, I don't like control so much with the questions, just like main questions, and then see what happens, because in the end, what comes from heart goes to other people's hearts. So there is like an aim why I say the guest is a storyteller, because the format of the podcast is a kind of story to inspire us, because the aim in the end, it's about us getting inspired by people, and hopefully we transform this inspiration to actual action in our offices when we really work with the projects.
In February, I had the great pleasure of connecting with artist and performer Shea Donovan. Although we got into some tough topics, there was a lot of joy and positivity in her approach to working online during lockdown.
Part of my philosophy a little bit here has been to kind of resist adapting existing work to the digital space, which I see a lot of people doing beautifully. And I think there's a need for that. And that's a great way to exercise your practice if that's your, what you're feeling called to do. But I think for me, what I've been enjoying is creating work specifically within these restrictions, like being very intentional about embrace those restrictions and those obstacles and maybe mine them for a different way of making work rather than trying to adapt my normal practice within the constraints of the digital space. So I've been enjoying creating and collaborating in new ways, which has been fun.
March was a bumper month indeed, with 3 fantastic episodes, as well as celebrating the podcast's 3rd anniversary with a special offer on Patreon and freshening up the branding. I had a great time talking with artist Clinton Kirkpatrick, then producer Todd Zimmermann, actor Katrina and production manager Debra Beardsley from Audiovisual Entertainment, followed by filmmakers Lars Henriks and Nisan Arikan. Here's Clinton, Todd, Katrina, Debra, Lars and Nisan talking about creating characters and world building.
Yeah, so this kind of like, for me, there is I've realized a lot of power in storytelling, and even what I'm doing now in my own research and in my own investigation is I've gone right back to what mythology is, and then within mythology, what creation myths are. And I'm actually in a process of investigating various creation myths that have existed throughout human history in all different cultures. And what I'm doing is I'm taking pieces of that, whether it is modern day creation myths or Egyptian creation myths or whatever the creation myth is. I mean, there's these slug characters keep coming into my work, and I read this creation myth recently where, these slugs fall from the sky and they create this boggy, marshy area. And then from this, the first humans came to be. And I'm just like, this is thrilling. It is the power of storytelling. It's the power of art. For me, that is what my work is. People will look at my work and they're like, what is that? Or you're mad. Or I've listened to it all over the years. I don't really care either, but it's like, I've listened to it all. But I always think if you take the time with any artist, you have to be interested, obviously, in what they're doing to want to investigate it. But certainly for me, when you start to investigate what my work is and what my practice is, there is a whole lot there. There's a whole lot of world and, a whole lot of world to see. And there's a whole lot more still to come out of me,
When we created this to really give it that immersive experience, we asked all of our performers to not only bring their characters to life, but bring their characters to reality, in the fact that we asked for Facebook pages to be created or Instagram accounts or LinkedIn, or, we wanted to give them an online presence that our audience could go and find these characters in the real world. Each of their characters has a website that is dedicated to their character's profession or backstory. So for those audience members that want to really go down the rabbit hole or really explore, there are opportunities to find hints of these characters living on the internet. So, and I know, Katrina, you've got some fun stories of guests that have reached out to you, but I want you to speak, if you can, on the creation process of trying to help build this character, not just when you were on stage for that hour and a half, but that lives in the real world.
I mean, it was a fascinating experience for me because I'm used to the reverse of constructing my character based on the clues in the text and tailoring that to the text. Well, in this case, I'm creating the text. The text is mirroring, it's a flip of that kind of process. But the exciting thing about being engaged in that creation is that you know the material so well. My character works at a bar and I can rattle off the drinks menu and when in doubt, it gives extra fodder to rely on. And I had a lot of fun. My bar is a literary themed bar, so I got to come up with the most terribly punny names, such as a George R.R. Martini or a picture of Dorian Grey Goose, Frankenstein, all terrible, and I have so much fun. And so then I can make a game throughout the show of kind of assigning a signature cocktail to a guest, and that material at hand to go back to is fun. And it is interesting having this online presence with the character. I've had people reach out to me through my character Maggie's Instagram, and they genuinely they think I am Maggie. There are elements of me in Maggie, but I'm not a bartender musician on the low side. I know, but it's really someone was asking when my next gig was, and I was like, I mean, I'm performing virtually from my apartment. That's my gig. So it is funny how it's fabulous. It states how much they invested and believed in the world, and I think having those tie-ins to we're all so connected on social media and things, and having this character have those elements as well grounds them as a human. One of the videos on my character's Instagram is me playing accordion, and I've had people reach out to me asking about the accordion, which I will always happily talk about. It's a great way to connect, and a fun added, it creates another layer of immersion of that it integrates in that technology even beyond the show.
We had a really robust writing team when we were first coming up with this. I mean, we all kind of sat around a table or sat in Zoom meetings just trying to nail down the concept, nail down the story. We had 30 plot points that came and went. And then the amount of research, we have an entire tome that talks about all of these libraries, these historical libraries that are actual places, that had actual significance in history. And we had to pull all of that material just so that we could give that tome to the performers, so that way they had that fodder to keep pulling from as well. But we didn't, Todd and I, we didn't just create this. It was such a collaborative effort. We were getting materials every day. I remember, our writing team would send us a draft of one scene, while at the same time somebody would send me a draft, a character, Katrina would send me the bar menu, and then the next day somebody else would send me a song. I think Katrina, you even wrote an entire song.
I wrote one song. It had a clue. It fell by the wayside as we changed the gameplay in rehearsal. But I had one song with that, and then there's another song. A character was linked to another one who's a history teacher, and I made a ditty that was a mnemonic device about the Ptolemaic Empire.
It's incredible.
I will say, for a song all about murder and incest, it's done on the ukulele, so it's pretty charming, I will say.
And during the pandemic, which has been such a time of, we've all had to go inside of our bubble, right? A lot of us were missing that creative outlet. So I think that pulling in all of these performers and whatnot too, it allowed everybody to find a quick creative outlet in a time where we're all very frustrated because we can't live our lives as normally as we want, right? So I don't even think we tasked people with some of the stuff that got created. I just said, hey, could you have a little ditty? Because I think that Maggie, I think Katrina, your character and this other character, they know each other and they went to school together or something. And next day I have a page-long 12 verses of the Ptolemaic Empire, So it really gave us all a chance to be really creative, and push the boundaries of how can we keep telling stories in a new and imaginative way and just make everybody laugh, because everything is so 2020 right now.
Then we did this DIY thing again with a little more budget this time. We worked for an acting school. We worked with their students on a movie together based on their character wishes, because Lars and me, we are also from the acting department, so we could work with that, and we are making films. We could work with that. So the second movie we did together was also on many festivals and was, how do you say entdecken? His English is better than mine.
It was discovered?
It was discovered from a release at a Blu-ray releaser.
Oh yes, got released in the US. It's behind us.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
On Blu-ray, yeah.
As a RES cinema. So I was really proud of that and really happy about it. The second movie is about 7 girls in the forest, in a maybe cursed forest. So it's kind of fantastical, but very, very subtle. And it was the first time for us that we worked with an ensemble. And those were 7 girls who were like in their 20s.
Early 20s. They were just finishing drama school.
Not so easy, but it was fun. And it was also, for us, we learned a lot to work with a big group.
I work very closely with the actors for all of that. Like when we were developing Leon, I think Nisan and I had just started hanging out again, and I don't know, I was thinking about how to do a lo-fi science fiction project. I was still dreaming about getting into cinemas and making something that would translate to a wider audience. So I was thinking about how can I use genre to do that. That was on my mind, and then I think we just had a really long conversation about death, because that's the fun guy I am. And I basically just took that conversation, which was really long, and turned it into a script. So there would be these 2 characters in its center, which I think Aqua is Nisan and Leon is not me, but there would be a lot of the stuff in there that we had discussed. That's how that sort of came about. So I, in that sense, worked with Nisan to come up with it all. And then for Bear Kittens and later Perfomaniacs, actually, we started working with this acting school, like Nisan said. I was a teacher there, and I got sort of bored with teaching acting and not doing anything. So I started developing characters with the students. I had originally planned, this was Nisan's idea too, to make short films with them so they could use that for their demo reels. And in case of the Bear Kittens group, we quickly realized, all right, this is not a short film. This is possibly a feature. And they came up with their characters. I had different exercises to improvise and to come up with characters intuitively, plus with characters that would fit them and would be what they would need in a demo reel too. And then I would have them improvise with each other and come up with scenes. And then slowly we would all see, all right, this is a possible setting. Like all the characters you came up with would probably do community service at some point. They're all pretty antisocial. And then we would put the characters in situations together and see how do these interact. And then we would think, all right, you two make an interesting comedic duo. So let's think about that. And I think we had half a year. It was really luxurious in case of Bear Kittens. We had half a year of just playing around, and then I would go and have seen all this stuff they would have come up with themselves, and then I would just write the script according to that. And it was more compressed with the next thing we did with that school, with Perfomaniacs, but it's really similar too. Then we made a web series together, also called The Acting Students. We worked a lot with that school to fund our projects, where we would have them improvise all their dialogue on set. Then I would just go, okay, now that thing you said was funny, do that again. So yeah, from this very close work with the actors, their characters and dialogue, I like that, and I like the results.
Yeah, me too.
We got musical in April with host of the World Fusion show, Derrik Jordan, and musician Dan Hughes, who talked about muddling through in less than ideal lockdown circumstances.
We used to do live improvisations when I was working at BCTV in Brattleboro, but because of the lockdown, it's been closed. So we've done various workarounds. One is that I will get my artists to record a solo video of them playing, and then I will basically play along with that and try to pretend that it's live. Sometimes, well, depending on how good I'm able to do that, you would think it is live a lot of the times. Most of the time, I seem to be able to pull that off. But now that we're in lockdown mode, I've stopped doing the live or this kind of improvisation overdub with their video. The new format that I'm using is just taking pre-recorded videos from my guests. And that's been the last few shows, just because I wanted to keep the show going. I felt it was more important to keep the show going, so I'm not doing the live music right now. But we'll get back to it. I mean, things will open up again and we'll be able to do that again. But we have a great audio engineer and we have 3 cameras at BCTV, so the quality is very high. Somewhat limited now more with my Zoom calls. But it's still fun, and I get to showcase these fantastic artists, and I feel like the workaround is better than not doing the show at all, so I'm just trying to keep everything going forward.
What has your lockdown experience been as a musician?
Well, initially panic, because I was like, my money's gone, what am I going to do? Probably like most of the world. And then I sort of got into a new routine. So I thought, well, this is I kind of looked upon it as that I have the rest of my life to gig and perform. And, I'll probably be doing it when I'm 80. They'll be wheeling me out to the local pub or something, and I'll be playing a gig. So taking 2 years out, 3 years out even, hopefully not. But in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing too big. So I thought, well, I might as well try and utilise the time I have to try and be as productive as I can be and flex new muscles, really. When you do lots of gigs, you end up just being on autopilot and sort of doing the same thing all the time. It's sort of can be very relentless. From 23, I've done like 200 gigs a year pretty much. So for the past 10 years. So that's very tiring. So it's good to kind of step away from that really and be creative and write music and talk to people like you on podcasts and connect with new people. It's good. Yeah, people kind of put themselves in a frame of being like either a musician or a filmmaker or a podcast, social media person, or really above all those things, we're creative people. They're just vehicles for what you do. Above that, you should be creative and try and, like for me, I play music, but actually above that really is for me to be creative and to pursue like a free lifestyle that I can navigate myself. That's more important to me than actually playing music. As much as I love playing music, like I want a lifestyle that I can control and be the kingmaker of, basically. And I think most creative people strive for that. Because there's little point being in, I've had jobs playing music where on paper they sound amazing, but at the end of the day, you're working for somebody else and you're in a controlled environment, which isn't always good.
We went stateside in May with a fabulous catch-up with my old pal from Queen's University Belfast, Dr. Gary Rhodes, and my new friend, fellow arts podcaster, Nathan Ragland.
And you remind me so happily of my arrival in Ireland, but also, though I try to be unflappable, that's impossible. And one of the spookiest moments, and not in a horror film spooky, but I guess you'd say nervous moments, was when I walked in to teach that course because I felt a little out of place, not only as an immigrant myself and living in another country for the first time, but I felt a little, I would have never wanted to seem presumptuous in teaching a course on Irish cinema in Ireland. Mm-hmm. I had taught Irish cinema actually in America previous a couple of times, but that was a bit nervous actually going in to teach all of you because I thought, gosh, I feel ill at ease or ill-informed maybe, to take that on since as an American in Belfast. But I suppose my interest would be twofold. And one, I think it started with horror. And there's certainly these tremendous connections between horror and Ireland, Irish literature, Irish folklore, from obviously the Banshee through a film I saw. And I don't think a lot of Irish film scholars, I don't know that any of them ever really talked about it much, but when I was 10, 12 years old, I was in love with horror movies. I was also in love with Francis Ford Coppola, who had directed the Godfather films and Apocalypse Now. And early in his career, he had made a film called Dementia 13.
Oh, right.
Early 1960s. And it was a gothic horror story set in Ireland. And it was actually shot in Ireland. And, it's readily available on YouTube. It's a rather well-known film in terms of Coppola studies because it was basically a second film. But I think in Irish film studies, it's completely unknown. But the connections go deeper. Stoker was Anglo-Irish. There's such a great tradition of Irish Gothic novels. And as I grew in my interest in horror, I grew in my interest in horror literature as well as horror films. films. So there's all these fantastic connections and Irish horror stories on film. But the other thing that happened to me when I was a teenager was by about the age of 13. And of course, I grew up in the state of Oklahoma. I grew up in a town that, in American terms, certainly most terms, we'd probably consider a small town of 25,000 people. I grew up in, I guess, I'm trying to think of the best way to say it, but probably as a Native American and everything, kind of a masculine type culture in that terms or that parameters. And so John Huston's films spoke to me greatly as a teenager. His films like The Maltese Falcon and African Queen, and these films with Humphrey Bogart, who was one of the great cinema tough guys, and, his later films like The Man Who Would Be King with Sean Connery and Michael Caine. And, you can kind of probably quickly understand maybe or see that, kind of, okay, a lot of his films and his life too. I became fascinated by Huston's life. He was quite an explorer and hunter and, very masculine and all of that, very much a Hemingway. He was kind of the Hemingway of 20th century American cinema. And he was deeply interested in Irish literature. And by the time I was in high school, he was making his film The Dead, based upon Joyce. Yeah. And there was an incredible documentary film made about him, Huston, and it showed the behind-the-scenes footage. It showed him talking at length. This was before the kind of making of featurettes we know today. By and large, there were some examples, but they weren't. It was before DVD. It was before that cottage industry, so to speak. So I became entranced. By the time I was 16 and 17, I became entranced with James Joyce and The Dead. When Huston said in his mind it was probably the greatest short story ever written in the English language, that spoke volumes to me. The film version he made, which I found to be quite faithful. I'm talking at length for a question and maybe getting boring, but my interest came from these different angles, from horror as well as Joyce. And then about that same time, Beckett, because I was also, one of my other favorites as a teenager was Buster Keaton. And Samuel Beckett had made a Keaton film, later in Keaton's life, of course, and a kind of avant-garde film. And I was also getting entranced, and it's easy to romanticize things when you're a teenager, and and the passion for it all. And I was getting interested in Beckett because of his work with Keaton. And I was particularly intrigued because Kevin Brownell had made this incredible documentary about Keaton, and he had footage of Keaton saying, he didn't even understand the film he made with Beckett, Which I think is called I'm thinking, yes, he's one of the... yeah, exactly. And here's one of the genius filmmakers in my mind, Keaton. Yeah. But he's saying he didn't quite even understand it, but he liked Beckett and everything. And so I was coming at Ireland from all these different directions. Yeah. Wow. And then to conclude, I would say that in the 1990s, America has always had this love affair with Ireland. Yeah. There's regrettable exceptions during some immigration periods, maybe in the 19th century and so forth. But there's been a lot of love affairs in the later 20th century, certainly from, everybody, celebrating St. Patrick's Day to the 90s when the Commitments, particularly the film version, U2, there was a particular love affair with, it had happened different times before. In the 60s, I think, with JFK for a lot of people. But in the 90s, it was like there was Neil Jordan and Jim Sheridan's films were exploding onto the scene. Yeah. My Left Foot had won, the Academy Award. And of course, I was graduating from high school and about to start university right at that moment. Then there's U2. And then I particularly fell in love. Like I heard it on the radio and I was driving. I remember the moment so clearly. I was driving down I-40 in Oklahoma City, an interstate that runs throughout a lot of America. And I'm burning down the highway in an old car, the only one I could afford at the time. But I'm burning down the highway and this voice comes on the radio, this band. And I hear it, but I didn't know the name. And I had to ask a friend later that day, who is singing this? And it was the Cranberries.
I thought you were going to say that.
You guessed it. You're always ahead of me. But, I heard, including that kind of Irish wailing at the end of the song, which went from the Irish but meeting pop music to an even more Irish sound at the end. And it just seemed to speak to me in ways. And again, as a more romantic young person, romantic maybe more in the German sense of that term, my great-grandfather was from Ireland. His name was McCord. So I'm Cherokee and mainly that, but I have a McCord whose family was actually from the north of Ireland, even though he came to America from Cork. And I met him once as a little tiny child. I barely remember. He fought in World War I, all of that. And so I had that connection to Ireland as well. So forgive this long biography
No,
here,
it's amazing. I
autobiography,
didn't know this.
but there were so
Yeah.
many ways that I fell in love with this. And then I fell in love with an Irish woman who was in America, and all roads led, and they had to lead where they had to lead. And it was this tremendous love affair. I cannot tell you how achingly I miss Carrickfergus.
Oh, yeah.
One of my favorite places, how much I miss the Belfast city centre, the people there. There's so many, Dunluce, there were so many places I liked to go and go repeatedly. Just an unending love affair.
There's nothing ever wrong with having that position with that stuff. If you're not judging the culture around you, then you're just being ignorant to whatever's going on, and being ignorant, not understanding the culture is not going to nourish you as someone that appreciates the culture. And, being a producer, if you're going to make content, make sure you make it with a good purpose. I mean, if you think you're producing the content that you think is going to help the culture one way or another, who am I to stop you? I think part of us being podcast, especially us being an art podcast, is preserving the culture a little bit. So in a way, we're sort of helping with people understanding and analyzing the culture. I'm sure you have on several occasions, gone back to seeing how movies were in the 50s and 60s and 70s stuff, and seeing the mentality that the world had then and seeing how different it is now. Well, the stuff that we're making right now, can you imagine what people, 20, 50, 100 years from now, if they go back and stumble upon this and analyze, wow, this is what their culture was like during this kind of situation. And how much you want to bet that at least 2 or 3 generations from now, people are going to be curious on how people were during COVID, and they're going to go back to these podcasts and stuff and be like, wow, this is how they got through COVID. We talked about before, but you said it yourself, we're the public access TV. Well, have you ever gone back and see some of those old public access TVs and see just how they did their stuff? How they would set up their shows? Again, getting that look into their realities and such. If we were watching movies in the 70s or something like that, how much the Cold War may have influenced them to make certain movies and such. That's something that we're never going to experience, but as an analyst, we can look back on how they're making movies in the 70s and such, realize, okay, this is how they got through the potential existential dread that they could die tomorrow from nuclear warfare. Going back to the 30s and such, seeing all those the classic Looney Tunes and such, or the classic cartoons where they influence or they inspire people, hey, you should go to war, or you should help people, invest in the military and such. As an analyst, you go back to that's how they got through the potential dread that they could be air raided by Germany tomorrow. That's something to help them. As an analyst, you're always going to be looking back. And so if we're making the stuff right now that other analysts can eventually look back on, then it's going to benefit society at the end of the day.
June was all about creativity with artist Chloe Gibson, aka Slayer One Artwork, and Dr. Rabya Mughal, a researcher with University College London's Community COVID project.
Definitely. So, I can't say, it's sort of been easy, but definitely being able to have people who do, because I've had, the opposite end of the spectrum where people sort of knock you down. It's awful. And, when I started selling at comic conventions, that was a really difficult time because you get really harsh critics at that point. And it's I'm just here to sell my artwork. I'm not here for, I'm always open to critique anyway. It's just some people are just unfortunately not very nice. And I think, especially when you're around other people, you should always want to encourage people, because I've always believed in positive reinforcement or positive pushing people. I'm always happy to criticize someone in a positive way. If someone says, tell me everything that's wrong with this, I was like, well, I will, but as long as you let me tell you what's right with it as well. But yeah, it's great. And also in Leeds as well, one of the amazing conventions, it's moved to Harrogate now, but Thought Bubble Festival, that was an art festival, and that was one of the first proper conventions I went to. I used to go religiously with my best friend and my twin sister and my friend Amy as well, and we'd all go and just look at all the amazing artwork, and it's something we'd planned for all year. We'd be like, oh gosh, there's all these amazing comic artists and writers coming, oh, we need to do this, we need to plan this, and then we'd go there and just have such an amazing time and see such amazing artwork. I actually met such a lovely woman called Valentina, and she ended up, I think I met her at Thought Bubble, and again, her work was so inspiring. That was another artist who's been amazing to me. She ended up designing my first ever tattoo. She designed it for me, and gosh, she was so lovely, and she's helped with my artwork as well, and she's bought one of my, she moved back to Italy. I miss her all the time, but she moved back to Italy, and she still bought one of my shirts. She was like, I need one of your shirts. You're like, I need one, so I sent one over to her, and oh gosh, it was amazing. But yeah, supportive wise, yeah, I think it's really important, and personally, I try to make sure that I'll support anyone and everyone. I might self-deprecate, but I don't allow my friends or anyone else creative wise to self-deprecate. That's not how it works in my house. But yeah, I think especially if you're wanting to start out, just don't be so critical of yourself. That's probably the advice that I've given to myself. Even now, I need to follow that advice because people think that they have to be perfect straight away. We're in a society where we feel like we have to do everything right the first time, and it's not like that at all. I'm sure if I'd have given up, I wouldn't have done any shirts. I'm sure there's a lot of people who probably would have thought they were missing out, and it's quite warming to know that people really like my artwork, even if sometimes I don't like it as much. Like, there's so many people out there think, oh gosh, you're really, really good. I'm like, it's sort of like imposter syndrome a little bit, like, oh.
So some of the workshops that we've been doing with participants have been around people's experiences of lockdown, their experiences of the pandemic, their experiences maybe of accessing services or experiencing loneliness or isolation or the anxiety that's come with the pandemic, and expressing that through art forms. So we've run a couple of very, very interesting workshops. The first one was run by somebody called Mariae, who works with us, who is actually a PhD student who's working on interventions with people with dementia. And so she does lots of really interesting things such as embroidery. So the mindfulness that comes with embroidery, and also the fine motor skills and, everything that comes with doing this very, very intricate and thoughtful thing for a long period of time. Her workshop was on collage, and we looked at how we might be able to express our feelings through the medium of collage. And, that might involve looking at lots of old magazines and, bits of paper and things that you might have lying around, and looking at maybe words in newspapers and picking them out and thinking about why you're picking them out. And so, when you see somebody's collage on a piece of paper, they might have used a certain colour. They might have used a certain picture. They might have used certain words to bring the picture together. So it might look like a complete mess of a picture. It might not look completely aesthetically great. It might look wonderful. That's beside the point. What the point of the collage is to look at it and think, how does this reflect my experience? And in looking at reflecting my experience, how do I then talk about my experience? How do I frame my experience? And if I can have a sort of narrative around the experience, then maybe I might be able to address the issues that come up during the experience. For example, my collage in particular, and I thought this was very, very interesting when I was thinking why I was doing this myself. My collage looked at the Meghan and Harry interview, and I picked out pictures of Meghan and Harry, and for some reason I also picked out words that weren't to do with the interview but were around understanding and telling my side of the story and family and these kinds of things, and I'm picking these things out and thinking, why have I picked these things out? Maybe I'm thinking about my own family. Maybe I'm thinking about my own way that I project myself, or the way that I am talking about how I've experienced things. And when you look at these, and then you look at everybody's collages, and you ask everybody to talk about their collages, you can see some very, very, very interesting stories. You hear about people's experiences. And rather than sitting down and doing a traditional interview with somebody, which we might do in research, and it might be very, very structured, when you get somebody to express their opinion through the medium of art, through the medium of collage, you might get a lot more rich data from that. You might get a lot more interesting data from that, or you might get more of a glimpse of the person rather than a set of structured answers that they might want to tell you just to tell you. So we run these workshops just for that purpose, to understand how people have been experiencing COVID. And that's one of the things that we've been doing as part of the Community COVID project. We've also done a lot of focus groups with people. So we've spoken to link workers and social prescribers, and people that are working in the community, people that are working in arts engagement in the community, people that are working in local authorities and social workers and teachers, to ask them about what do you think are the barriers to participation? What can we do to make these things much more accessible for people? And what do you think are the issues around what's happening in arts participation and stuff? Yeah, and as well as that, we're doing lots of traditional quantitative work, which we have to do as well.
We headed back to the States in July for excellent conversations with Dr. Troy Hall and Pam Munter to talk about their newly published books, Fanny Rules and Fading Fame.
What I would just really, like to thank you again for giving me a chance to talk about my mom and to really promote the Fanny Rules book. it's so important to those of us who have been caregivers with people who've suffered with Alzheimer's and dementia to understand that it's not an easy, road to be on. We have to find ways. We all have to find our own ways to give those memories back. We know that our loved ones are not going to remember them, no matter how much we want them to. They'll have moments when they'll remember them, but they won't be the same. And those memories, when they're stolen from you, find a way to give them back. And this was just my way of giving those memories back to my children, my grandchildren, my brother and his family, a way for them to kind of remember, grandma in a way in which they wouldn't have remembered her normally. Yes. And so now when you see and hear Fanny Rules, you'll know that I'm talking about my mom. Well, women power, if you think about it, I mean, there's such a great, strong, conversation about that is the fact that here we have an individual with a 12th grade U.S. education, which means no college, no formal education beyond that, who is wise beyond her years. I mean, things that she would tell me. One of those conversations that she would tell me is about being mediocre. She says, don't be mediocre. Don't be lukewarm. She says, you want to be hot, you want to be cold. She said, because mediocre is just blah and it just settles for whatever. And so I took that message and I then crafted it into this one. And it's that mediocre settles to the bottom, then complains about the view. And I never wanted to be a person who complained about the view. I wanted to celebrate the view. And so she would also tell me that I could be anything I wanted to be. So if you want to understand how I could actually move from this poor town in West Virginia and actually receive 2 postgraduate degrees, end up with a PhD, all of this is because the fact that this woman said, I can be whatever I wanted to be, but whatever I wanted to be the best of it that I can. And she didn't put any parameters on it. She said, if you want to be a janitor and you want to sweep floors, she said, then be the best floor sweeper there is. And Fanny told me that I needed to clean in the corners because she said a good floor sweeper will clean in the corners because anybody can sweep in the middle.
I've been a feminist since I was about 8 and tried to get girls into Little League. That wasn't possible back then. So I'm hoping that it will ring that bell loudly, that this is what we do to women and what we've always done to women in this business. And we need to rethink that because it's not worth it. People's shelf life, it shouldn't be a matter of shelf life. It should be a matter of what they can contribute and for how long. My publicist was telling me that a lot of the people who are reviewing it are women. So I would guess that's the natural audience. I mean, the subtitle is Women of a Certain Age in Hollywood. But I think anyone who is curious about how things were, you don't have to be a film historian to be curious about how a Harvey Weinstein could happen and be such an ogre for so many years. How did he get away with that? The casting couch goes all the way back, and it was a normal, accepted event. If a woman wanted to be up on that screen, she had to lie down on the couch first. That was just unfortunately a given. I don't know that that's true anymore. I don't think it is. Certainly there are those predators out there, but it's not as widespread as it once was. And I think anybody who cares about that issue will be curious about these stories. At least I hope so. It was fun to write because of the feminist background. I'll say that because I was a clinical psychologist for so many years, I felt that I could get inside their heads and give the reader some idea about how women think about these things, how they process that kind of oppressiveness and disappointment and the edging process itself. As we know, some of them did pretty well with that. I think the strength to my writing is always the internal dialogue. It's not so much what happens, it's how the woman processes the information. And that was extremely fun to write because I think I know more about that probably than anything, having been in practice so many years.
I took some time off in August and released some backup material while I was away from the computer. June and July were really busy with recordings and normal service resumed, with guests focusing on positivity and creativity, respectively Dominic Sim and Daniel Hess.
I mentioned a lot younger generation because I'm pretty old right now. I'm around 40, right? So I can say people younger than me. So things like that. So that's what I want to say. And I want to tell people. But of course, it's not good to hear it sometimes. The younger people will feel like it's like nagging. You're nagging me, right? So I kind of want to bring it out in a more reality form that these things does happen. It happens to everyone. So I want to talk about it. It happens to everyone. We cannot hide it. We have to break through the wall and share it. Now, as a man, it's difficult for me. Like, for example, it's hard for me to show my feelings to my wife sometimes. She's like, yo, you don't hold my hands anymore. And it's like, why don't I hold hands anymore? I don't know why. It's not like I'm a touchy-feely kind of guy, you know? It's hard to open up sometimes. So doing this podcast actually helps me as well, because I feel like if I do good out there, good will come back. If I motivate people, I will motivate myself as well. Just like there was a YouTuber that I was watching the other day. He said, everyone has the same amount of time in a week. What we do in that time brings us success or differs between different people. So if I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is I look at my cell phone and go through Instagram or whatever. Instead, I could have used that, few seconds in the morning when I wake up, look in the mirror and say, I'm going to do well today. So that actually brings a little bit of impact to your own life and to, anyone's life, right? Or if you're a kid and you're in the house, if you wake up in the morning, instead of going downstairs and say, hey, mom, what's for breakfast? You could say, hey, mom, good morning, right? Did you sleep well? Things like that. I mean, it's just a small, tiny thing that can actually brighten a person's life, like a person's attitude. If my kids actually wake up in the morning and say, hey, Dad, good morning. I was like, oh, I feel good. I feel good. Not a whole good, but still good, right? It's just one step upon one step. We build upon it. Just one tiny happiness upon another happiness. I feel like eventually everything will fall into place and everything will pick up from there. So it becomes like a 7 habit, right? A habit.
It's been an interesting sort of journey for me in the film space, because like I said, it was really my good friend who is a lot more in depth with film. I'd always grown up watching films and really enjoying cinema, but for me, it wasn't something I ever really thought about getting into. What was interesting was I feel like what I've sort of looked back and found with everything is that for me personally, I think that the storytelling aspect is really where I feel like I've always had the most depth and success with, but I've always kind of struggled with the transition from page to screen. As far as like visualizing what angles to use and constraining myself to like, okay, if I put the tripod here with this sort of lens, like this is the result I'm going to get. I can't do it in my head. So, for a long time, I really was telling myself, okay, I really want to do writing and directing and I can take on both. But with the project that I did in 2018, I really found that, while I can do it and I can make it happen, I feel like it's better for me to have the right people by my side that can actually translate what I'm writing better than even I feel like I can. And again, maybe that's some kind of like weird mental hurdle, which in 10 years I'll figure out that like it was just me sort of protecting myself from actually making the films as a director myself. But at least at this stage in my life, I'm sort of feeling like where I need to go with things is finding really good directors who can translate the writing in the way in which I can write the writing, if that makes sense. It's one of those things where as I'm writing something, I almost see it as kind of a stage play. Whereas like everything's just kind of a flat canvas and it's all sort of coming to life around me, but I'm not seeing like, okay, when this person's talking like this, if I have this sort of camera movement or something like that, none of that enters into my mind, even in the least bit. I think with, as time's going on, I've just sort of made that mental jump. So it's been nice because as I look back on everything, a lot of the films that I've made or worked on, I was either more as like a co-director or somebody that was there just on set helping things go smoothly, maybe more as a producer or something like that. And those have always been, in my mind, the best films that I've made with a good team. And not one of those things where, when I've tried to make them, I feel like they work and I feel like they have a good message to them. But as far as how everything comes out on the screen, there's just not a lot of refinement. I feel like I'm more of this, let's just have the camera free flowing and stuff like that. And that always just doesn't work as best as it could for something that's just more visualized by someone who can make that transition more than I can.
In September, audio drama producer Beau helped us celebrate our 100th episode in true nerd style with fascinating stories about adapting his father's literary works, while also contributing to advancements in audio technologies and modes of production. We then heard from Dr. Fiona Noble about her research in contemporary Spanish cinema and talking about alternative approaches to academic study.
I have to say I'm fantastically lucky in that I'm pretty good with the theory of things, but not so good with the practice. And so I have a producer editor who is amazing at figuring out ways of executing the crazy ideas that I come up with. And he's passed away a few years ago, but I had this wonderful, wonderful engineer, which I believe you saw the post on. Not only was he terrific at recording things, but he could just build devices that I imagined or I needed to have. The particular thing that we were talking about, I have to give you a little bit of background. So I like working in stereo. I like doing as much with the stereo space as I possibly can. One of the hardest things was to figure, do I want to block actors around in the stereo space and then somehow block the production or the creation of sound effects in some way that tracks them, and when you put all of this stuff in the same recording will line up and sound like it's at the same spot? This was a nightmare. Very difficult to do. And of course, the more you utilize the stereo space, the more difficult it is. And I like to get really clean dialogue tracks. I like to not worry about anything but the voices when I'm in the studio. That's the only thing I want to deal with. I record all of my voices mono, but on individual tracks. They can be panned around the stereo proscenium and placed with both panning, so panning and volume, and a little bit of reverb to create, are they further back? Are they closer to you? Things like that. But then how to make the sound effects follow them. So I was talking to Howard, our engineer, and there's some kind of a joke. It's only funny to engineers, and I don't really understand it, but they would make this joke about a monophonic pan pot, meaning somehow that you would pan something from left to right in mono, which of course you can't do. I had heard him say that a couple of times, and I was like, Howard, we've worked with MS technology, which I'll explain in a second, and I want you to build me a monophonic pan pot. And so he did. He drove away to Utah, and about 3 months later, he came back with this device. Okay, so this is the panner, and over here we've got one of the knobs is the volume, which basically does your in and out, and this does your back and forth. And okay, now I'll explain how this thing works.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think that was one of the key points that came back when I'd submitted the first draft of the manuscript to the publishers. And they talked about what I needed to do to pull that thread and that idea of subversive Spanish cinema through the book. Not that it wasn't there, but that, just by adding things like a conclusion to each chapter and an epilogue, that could kind of pull that thread together. And they asked the readers, and they're anonymous, obviously, they asked such pertinent questions that really made me think about the significance of that title and how it related to what I was talking about. Because I think if you look at the corpus of material for the book and the filmic corpus, it probably looks quite mainstream in some ways. I'm not necessarily looking at experimental filmmaking in Spain. That's not part of what that book's doing. There's some really interesting things happening in kind of alternative cinematic practices or filmmaking practices in Spain, especially kind of post-economic crisis. That's not my forte at all. That's not something that I'm particularly knowledgeable about. But somebody like Rebecca Naughton, who she has the blog Nobody Knows Anybody, where she talks about Spanish cinema. I don't know how active she is blogging at the minute. She's from the Northeast, actually. I don't know if you've ever come across her, but she's a really knowledgeable person about alternative Spanish cinema practices. That's not what this book is. It's not about kind of looking at what's happening out with the mainstream, if that makes sense. It's more about looking at, the key players of Spanish cinema. There are some films in there that are less well known. There are some filmmakers, the likes of Pedro Almodovar, who is probably, the most well-known Spanish filmmaker, certainly in the UK. But the book deals rather with subversiveness within those kind of mainstream contexts and looking at how the oppositional filmmakers who were working under Franco, so the likes of Carlos Saura or Luis Garcia Berlanga, Juan Antonio Bardem, who's the uncle of Javier, of course, people like them who were left identifying filmmakers under Franco, working during the dictatorship, during the very strict censorship conditions that there were at the time. So it's looking at those as kind of precursors to what's happening in contemporary manifestations of performance and representations of performance in contemporary Spanish cinema, and kind of seeing that thread come through from those oppositional filmmakers into the present day, and what that looks like and how that can become a means of speaking up against the common narratives or the dominant ideas in society.
October saw a reunion with Mariae Smiarowska, who I previously spoke to at the 2018 Late Shows. This time we discussed her Edinburgh Fringe performance, Landing. I also reached out to other friends of artist Sally Madge, and a bunch of us recorded memories of Sally for an episode released ahead of commemorative events marking the first anniversary of her death. In case you missed the hidden track at the end, we'll hear Sally's close companion and collaborator Tom Jennings reciting his verse, The North Sea Fat.
In a way, I found it in some ways liberating because I'm going to Edinburgh while I'm on an island in the Atlantic, And that's wild and hard to get my head around sometimes, but also very exciting. And I've got somebody who's producing who will be in Africa during the time of the production, and my director is in Ireland. It's just kind of also beautiful that I'm someone who's very international, and I've traveled a lot and I have friends all over the world. For me, it's always been about thinking, other time zones and languages, etc. So it feels like the world has kind of stepped up to accepting that as more common and normal and everyday. And that excites me because it's just really creating that feeling of connectivity globally. And I personally love that. So in a way, it has been liberating because it's like, wow, I'll be at Edinburgh virtually, but streaming from this island, but it can go worldwide. And it is a conversation that I think is a worldwide conversation, and hopefully worth having. And yeah, so it's exciting. It's exciting to have that. But I performed live for the first time the other week here on the island. We had a little open mic at the cafe. And actually there's a lot of performers on this island, strangely enough. And it was the first time I'd performed live in a year and a half. Last time was in Newcastle, actually. And it was just so exciting for everyone just to be like, we have this, sharing this moment with an audience. It's been difficult. Yeah, challenging, but if we can find a way to have a balance in the future, it's kind of interesting. It does open up a lot of possibilities. I know there's a lot of theater companies have in the States and in other countries, who've been working digitally already for years. So they were kind of ahead of the game a little bit, if you will. Yeah, it's an interesting chance. Yeah, like I'm saying, I think it's about the balance. It's not, I want it all to go online forever. No, I really don't. But how can we find a way to maybe, make a hybrid form of these mediums? It's interesting. It's been a learning curve.
Imagine a moderate offshore breeze when the tide begins to wane, with the lapping of tiny waves blown back against the grain. Pebbles in the sand crackle as they shift this way and that, while you stroll along the shoreline with Sally, chewing the North Sea fat.
In November, I nerded out with museum enthusiast Mackenzie Finkley and caught up with Brendan Conley talking about The Ticking World, a choose-your-own adventure calendar that we have very much enjoyed this month.
I do really enjoy this topic. I like talking about the British Museum because truthfully, I have a love-hate relationship with it. Because the very first time I got to visit the British Museum was in the summer of 2018. So I had not yet finished my degree. I was the summer before my senior year, budding anthropologist, just like jumping in my seat, waiting in line to get into the British Museum, because it is, you're absolutely right, this global institution where you can see thousands of years of human culture across the world in one place. And as I started walking through and seeing all of the things and wondering where they came from and how they came to be into that institution and learning more about the ways in which those objects were acquired, and then some of the contentions regarding the fact that a lot of those objects have been requested to be formally returned and subsequently denied. So the more I learned, the more that the magic was kind of stripped away from me. So it's both a really wonderful institution. I absolutely believe that something like that should exist. But at the same time, yeah, you have really big ethical questions that need to be answered. And yes, people do challenge me on this topic. They will often say, well, especially in the case of the British Museum, if they started giving things back, they'd have to give everything back and then they'd have nothing left, which is such an exaggeration and far from the truth. But I think that certainly concessions do need to be made.
Very simply at the start, you're told a few items you have in your inventory, and as you go through the story, you will lose and acquire other items. So at the most simple level, you're keeping a record of, I have a small lamp, or I'm carrying this, that, or the other, not to spoil any of the objects encountered, but you keep a total of those, and those can influence the choices that are available to you at different points. So, for example, if you've got a big gold key and you come across a big gold padlock, you can unlock it, and if you don't, you cannot. So at the most basic level, yes, you actually do a physical something, but there are other things you may wish to record and write down or draw at various points.
Finally, in December, I had a delightful time with Dave Lewis of the Cinemillennials podcast and learned loads about life as a jobbing actor in the US film and television industries from Katie Chonakis.
Yeah, it's funny that you say it's like kind of like a research project, which I think that's a perfect example of what it is, because I went to school for history. I'm trained, I don't want to say historian because, that's not my field. And I don't want to sound too pretentious either. I'm not going to call myself, I'm a film historian. But, I did study.
In a way you are. Don't play it off.
All right. I'll say it. I'm a film historian in a way. But no, I studied history and went to school for history because, as I said before, it was a lifelong passion. And I really do think that film is a good way of introducing, not exactly educating, because obviously, there's too much Hollywood stuff like The Last Duel, which is oh my God, the armor in that. But no, which is actually funny, like to go on a little tangent. Armor, medieval representations of armor are better in the first half of cinema rather than what is going on today, unfortunately. But okay. I think it's a great way to really see what people are into and see what they're not into, and then see how they can relate it back to our world today and how to understand what we're doing wrong or what we did do wrong in the past, whether it be through art or social movements, and how we can fix that today. And I think through filmmaking, that introduces a lot of topics that can be often difficult and can really but can really make them feel comfortable enough to talk about those issues.
So all of it is being an open vessel. So to be comedy, to be drama, and just really being open. And so when you're open, your team is sending you out for these projects, and you're going out for these projects, and you're up and you're down and you're crying and you're vulnerable and you're happy and you're quirky and you're sad. The most important thing is just to be true to your authentic self. You have your baseline, and then you have people you study with. Susan Batson, Batson. She has an amazing book called Truth. She's doing virtual. People can do drop-ins for $20 a day, Monday through Friday. She has a lot of international people who study with her. She's Nicole Kidman's acting coach for over 20 years, Juliette Binoche, Usher, Madonna, Oprah. She coaches all these people for their films. So being trained by the creme de la creme, right? So you can be trained at what level. And it's like the best investment you're going to make is in yourself, with your time, the quality of the food you eat, the coaches you study with, the podcasts you listen to, the people we associate with. So all of that goes hand in hand with the characters I choose, because based on life, it's not just linear, and I can tap into different experiences that I've personally experienced or that I've observed. So being a great observer, I love observing. And so if something directly hasn't happened to me, I can, with Google, you can research it. You can watch some like-minded movies. You can check out the director projects that they've been a part for. That's for films. For TV shows, the tone of the show, Grey's Anatomy, It's Always Sunny, Cold Case, the tones of the show, the casting director, know their body of work, go in there, do great work. You have to build a relationship with the casting director. If they keep bringing you in, they like your work, so they want you on the show, and it's just a matter of time before it happens. You just have to keep up and just show up and do great work. And then make sure you're taking care of with your body, mind, and spirit, because they, like I said, they're very hand in hand with one another. Doing different characters is like It's Always Sunny. It's like quirky, it's fun. And they're like, oh, they like that. Then that's permission to play, to take that a step further and discover where you can go. When you get on set, you've already done the preparation. So everything I'm telling you, studying, coaching, researching, That's the tone of the show. That's the preparation of the character before you show up. When you get to set, you already know your lines. You already know your character. And it's an opportunity to get out of your head and get more into your gut, into the intelligence of your body, and to play and be professional, because it takes a village and there's hundreds of people on set. And especially now, we want to be very mindful of staying within the parameters of everyone doing their job, the makeup artist, the hairstylist. Like if they ask you your opinion, cool, but they're already communicating with directors and assistants and people, and everyone has the domino effect of how they're showing up and everyone's doing their best. So, when you have the character, that's your ultimate time where you get to play and have a lot of fun.
Well, what a year it's been, and it's because of you, the listeners, that we're still going and approaching 4 years of learning more and more about different landscapes in audiovisual cultures. But I want you to tell me, what have you enjoyed? What would you like to hear more of and learn about? And what might be missing that we haven't touched on yet? And I know there's loads of topics that we haven't touched on and we're working our way around to. Let me know by email to audiovisualcultures@gmail.com or message avculturespod on any of the socials. It's been a true privilege to speak to so many interesting guests from such a diversity of backgrounds, and I'm really looking forward to what 2022 will bring. I'm always happy to hear from folk who'd like to guest on the show, and I'll be back nagging at my artist friends to come speak to you because they're class and you really need to know about them. For now, mind yourselves and catch you next time.